Dawson Rider Wiki.
Hey YouTube, Dawson Rider here with my series review for Uchu Sentai Kyuranger. So I'm going to dive in right away. I always say this in the beginning of longer series videos, but I want to try to streamline this a bit because there's a lot to go over, and after I say that it usually ends up being a 20+ minute video. But since there's going to be 12+ characters to go over in this, I want to start right away. And now I'm wasting almost 30 seconds talking about how I want to waste no time, so kind of a catch-22. But anyway, Kyuranger was a very interesting series because it was the first Ranger series that started with 9 Rangers. We knew things would be different from the get-go, and it was. I think what I liked about Kyuranger is, well, for me, like, over the course of the year, it helped me rediscover my love of Toku and Sentai. So I really enjoyed it, spoiler alert, for the most part. It wasn't perfect, and there's things I'll get into that in a minute, but it was very enjoyable, and I think it did a really good job of hitting the notes of what I like about Sentai, but while also charting some new paths of like doing things a bit differently, which I thought was great. To start with the story, at the core of it, the story is very simplistic. Large Empire rules, Rangers are rebellion, and that's the core of the whole story. And there's little intricate stories throughout it. I'm a good talker, guys, that's why I have this job. But the way they handled it wound up being pretty interesting. It started off, you know, okay, fun couple of first episodes, and then it was like, okay, this is pretty generic Sentai stuff. And I had a very rocky relationship with it, like in the first, I want to say 10 episodes, like right before Ryu Commander debuted. It was kind of a rocky start because the series started with this premise that could allow them to sort of planet hop and do all this different stuff, but then they found a way to pigeonhole themselves on Earth, and we were just doing really generic, dumb Sentai plots. And I'm like, oh man, you're wasting such potential. Lucky's shrieking. But then, after Ryu Commander and Kogama's debut, they were really hit a stride where like we would go from story to story. You know, we did the arc of the I forget the name of the ship, the ship Kyutama, whose name I'm forgetting right now, that led us to Tsurgi, and then the time travel arcs and Naga's arc, and they did a really good job of not having a lot of meaningless filler. Like, we did have a couple more fillery episodes later that dealt with like the Neitherlands and, you know, Penny and Elliot. No, that's Magicians. No, but like more filler episodes later. But after that first bit, they never felt not important. Like, even in some of the more frivolous ones, something would always happen in it that would further the story, which is something I've been asking for years from Toku, but of Sentai specifically, especially within Zyuohger and Ninja, where they would spend an awful lot of time doing an awful lot of nothing, where I'm like, it's okay to have filler. Filler doesn't have to be bad, because it can further the characters, and sometimes you can have a filler episode where something happens in it in the background or at the end to further it. And Kyuranger did a good job of that. But I was consistently impressed with the pacing of going from story to story, and they all flowed together naturally. And we wound up getting some neat arcs. I loved the build-up and then debut of Tsurgi. I loved Naga's arc. I thought it was great, unexpected. It lasted longer than I thought it would. You know how it is. I loved the time travel arc where they sort of became their own legend. I love arcs like that. Even though I didn't think it was perfectly done, the twist with Cuervo was cool. And I like when they split the team up. I think, could they have done better with this? Yes. But I think that they did a pretty cool job of eventually making good use of the large number of people. That was something, again, they initially struggled with. But eventually, I think they got a handle on it. I think it was growing pains because this is the first time I've had so many characters right off the bat to deal with. But eventually, they did a good job of balancing the characters. Balance. But, you know, of splitting them off into 2 different teams. So you get split focus. Sometimes you get more focus on one with little on the other. Sometimes they had episodes that focus on a couple characters. They would come up with reasons to get rid of them sometimes, which were kind of weird and unnecessary. But I think they did a good job with it. The conclusion, as I mentioned in my finale review, was kind of... I think the finale arc was one of the weaker arcs. I think they had cool ideas there with Cuervo becoming Dawn, but it just all amounted to a pretty generic ending, and could have been better, which is unfortunate. But a lot of it, when I reflect on it, was generic, but it was all about the sort of interweaving arcs in the middle that were well done, that were more about personal stuff and about origins, because there wasn't really any complicated stuff to that. But my two biggest complaints were probably that the final arc was weak and generic, and I really wish we could have gone more in depth into the Kyurangers mythology. From the get-go, I found, like, I always loved legend stories like that, of the legend of the 9 Kyurangers, and then I thought it was kind of interesting the way they found out they were basically their own legend, but I would have loved to have found out where the Kyutama came from, and I stated numerous times throughout my reviews this year that I really hope it wasn't something stupid like Zyuohger, where it was like, the Earth believes in us, so we got powers, and then it ended up being that. Space believes in us, and that's so generic, cheesy trash anyway, but setting that aside, because I mentioned in the finale review how it basically became sort of a, you know, dawn rose out of negative thoughts, and so I just kind of headcanon it a bit from the explanations we got that the universe sort of rose up these Kyuranger powers out of the constellations to meet that, kind of like the Force. So that's fine-ish, but I think there could have been such a more interesting mythology. I think that that could have really strengthened the series. And like I said, setting aside me hating those kind of cheesy things, it was something that intrigued me, and I miss having a Sentai that goes into mythology of the powers. And that doesn't have to be in every Sentai, because a lot of Sentais don't lean themselves towards that. But the last time we got an interesting mythology where we learned some interesting stuff about their origins and how they worked, I think was Kyuranger. And I think this Sentai really had the potential for that, and it's a shame we didn't get it. I think the closest we got was finding out about the legend and about basically the first Kyuranger in Sergi, and his background and little details like that he built Raptor. I think that time travel arc would have been perfect, like, to explore the original origins of the Kyuranger powers. But anyway, but yeah, that's the story. To go over characters, I'm going to try to go over this a little quicker just because there's so many. To start with Lucky. Lucky really surprised me. I started off on a hugely negative note with him because I hate Sentai Reds that are just crackhead loudmouths that shriek a catchphrase, and usually they're very stagnant characters. From beginning to end, they don't change, they're just a catchphrase. That's what I thought Lucky was, but he surprised me. He honestly matured over the course of the series into a more balanced character who would, instead of, you know, like most of those stagnant characters, still rushing into serious situations, shrieking, he was much more even-tempered, and his catchphrase wound up taking on an important meaning for both his arc and for the characters altogether, which I thought was well done. I was a little unclear of how that was going to work at the beginning of the series. I thought maybe it was going to be a tied somehow to the Kyuranger mythology, that he actually had luck, but it wound up just being positive thinking, which I think for me it was equal parts cheesy and unrealistic, but also inspiring. So I was really impressed with him. And there was some moments I didn't agree with him at the very end where he sort of spat on Sergi's potential sacrifice. And then I had people both on the comments and on Twitter telling me I didn't understand his character. It's like, no, I understand him, I just didn't agree with that. Like, you can understand a character's motivations but not agree with them. But setting that aside to spit on his friend's heroic sacrifice at the end, I wound up actually quite liking him. I don't think he's in my top 5 Reds, but maybe top 10. I actually thought he ended up being pretty good. I was, mainly because of how much it impressed me that they managed to actually balance out a crackhead Red character. And then I'll talk about him next since he ties into it, but Garu, unfortunately, I think got the least focus. I think Garu, Sparta, and the 2 girls probably had the overall least focus, but for me, Garu did have the least, and I liked him right off the bat. I liked his suit design, I liked his personality and voice actor, but he wound up basically just being Lucky's hype man, which I don't think there was anything wrong with having him be Lucky's closest friend in the sense that he was always supportive of him, but I wish he would have gotten a little more something, and I think he got the least development. I think you could argue that characters like Sparta maybe got equally less, but I think because Sparta had such a big personality and his goal was mentioned so often, it just made him stand out a little bit more. Speaking of Sparta, that pretty much says it all. His whole character is basically his dream of being a chef and using that to help people. And he was kind of one of those classic Sentai characters that also has a very prominent in-your-face quirk. So he didn't get as much outside of that. But because they did focus on it a couple times, and because it was mentioned so often, I felt like he stood out more than Garu in terms of I felt like he got more focus. Stinger got one of the more larger arcs of the series, especially early on. He was sort of the classic stoic badass. He was probably one of my favorites. I have 4 main favorites, and he's one of them. I love his suit. His story was generic, but I thought it was good. I thought it was interesting to have sort of a sleeper agent there at the beginning. I thought that was cool. There was some weird stuff at the beginning where, like, I wound up really liking his arc with Champ, but like at the beginning when he still thought Stinger killed his mentor, but still would be on the team with him and never questioned it. I thought that was weirdly done. But I really liked the arc with his brother, and it took a turn I didn't necessarily expect, which I'll get to when I talk about him. But I thought that was a really cool arc that led to a great friendship storyline with both him and Champ, and a like big little brother arc for him and Kotaro, which I thought was cool. So I really liked him. Hammy also didn't get the hugest amount of focus, but I always liked her personality, and I thought she got, again, like not enough, but she got enough little moments in a couple episodes that I felt she at least stood out in a way. Raptor also was kind of more quiet in the background, but she was very present because she was important to the ship. You know, she piloted the ship and she had an important relationship with both ships. I'm using the word ship a lot, but I did like her character story of that she basically watched all this happen from the sidelines, and that she just wanted to help be a Kyuranger, and she got to achieve that. And I wish she would have been seen more. I think some of it might have had to do with like the CG for her wings and stuff, maybe, but I still liked her. I think that she still stood out for me, even though she was in the background some, but I liked her sort of, she was kind of meek, but she really rose to the occasion when she needed to. Balance and Naga I thought were a great duo, and their arc ended up being quite different than I thought it would be. I remember mentioning early on in Naga's debut, even though his starting story was it seemed like he betrayed Lucky, but then he didn't, the way it was set up, honestly, in most other Sentais, their arc would have been a 1 to 2 parter where Balance relapsed and he became a thief again, or pretended to be a thief and then came back. Honestly, I thought that was going to happen. But what wound up happening was that it came about Naga, who had a very interesting arc, because after his initial arc, he just became, I remember saying, what even is Naga? It was entertaining to watch, because he would just be in the background, reacting to things weird, falling off of a table or something he was standing on, trying to look in the mirror. And then you had this really fascinating arc of him becoming evil for an extended amount of time compared to most stints that lasts, because usually those are short stints, and because he wanted to find emotions and he felt like his teammates were holding him back, and he unlocked too many negative emotions, and it was a little bit of manipulation because of the way his powers were unlocked, or his emotions were unlocked, but it was still his choice, and it was a very interesting twist on what I thought a Naga Balance story would be. And I also thought it was really interesting how Naga's whole goal was to find emotions, and he didn't really realize it, but he was. Like when he turned evil, he's like, I haven't found emotions yet, she can help me find them. But Hammy was like, you have, actually. And we saw as an audience that he has started to form human emotions, but he didn't really realize it until later. And I thought that was interesting, and I really liked their characters and their friendship. Let's see, am I missing anybody else from the core? I don't think so. So now moving on to additionals. So Commander Zhao ended up being one of my favorites. I remember when he first debuted, I thought he could either end up being really cool or really annoying. And luckily, I think he ended up being really cool, for me at least. I found him thoroughly entertaining. His humor always amused me. Especially, a scene that always stands out for me is when Big Bear was talking about how irresponsible he was. And Lucky was like, he'd really surprise you. And then it cuts scene to him going, we gotta blow up the sun, after being tied up because he tied himself up. And his quirky humor and kind of ego, where he would like build up fake legends for himself, like when he traveled to the past and like trying to make himself look cool, was just so entertaining. But what I liked about him is that he was so quirky and like adorably charming, but that never took away from moments of him being badass. And I always loved his storyline that he was basically a self-made Kyuranger. While he was trying to gather the Kyuranger, he made himself one because he needed to be, and I thought that was really cool. Kotaro also took me by surprise, because I kind of rolled my eyes when we found out we were getting a Kid Ranger, because usually Toku kids are some of the most annoying of the annoying, just a notch above Toby. And the last Toku kid I remember is Kiba Ranger. I know there was like King Ranger kind of, but I haven't seen O Ranger yet, but he was just basically a pervert. But Kotaro wound up being, honestly, until Lucky more matured, more balanced than Lucky personality-wise. And I liked his arc of wanting to stand up for Earth and for his brother and be a hero. And he had, like I said, a solid arc, and he wound up being a lot more balanced of a personality than I thought. And he took me by surprise as well. Sergi, I really loved Sergi. Oh, Champ! Wait, how could I forget about Champ? Because my 4 favorites are Stinger, Champ, Commander, and Sergi. But Champ, when I was going over the core ones, I just loved Champ's personality. He was one of those classic Toku characters where I just instantly took a liking to him. He kind of just had a bunch of cheesy, generic lines about justice, but I just really liked him, and I loved his partner bond with Sergi. His arc with Professor Anton ended up being kind of weird. I thought it was unnecessary to make this weird split personality story. I felt it was a bit jumbled and confusing, but overall I just really liked Champ. Okay, now it's Sergi. I really liked Sergi from the get-go. I loved his suit, I liked his storyline of him being like the original Kyuranger, I liked his personality, kind of reminded me of like a Japanese Barney Stinson, and I liked that he sort of had this big like, oh, I'm gonna save everyone, I'm the legend personality. And his storyline was about sort of that classic, like, you know, learning to get along with people's storyline. But it really was well done, I thought, to see him going from like, oh, I'm this huge ego legend to working with the team. And I just really liked his story and background. As far as allied characters, I feel like there's not a ton to go over. There was Orion in the past, which I think served a pretty neat purpose once we got to know him, and I liked his arc that led into the changing of the future and Lucky's power-up. There was a couple minor people we met throughout the galaxy and stuff, like the singer dude and that weird princess, which were all very okay. This isn't really a huge character, but I always liked the Pegasus armor, and I think it's a shame it wasn't used more. I just wanted to bring that up because I was thinking of characters, but there just really wasn't a ton of allied characters that stood out to me. I feel like I'm even forgetting some, but I don't even want to waste time on them. Speaking of, to get to villains, honestly, I think that was one of the weaknesses. I think overall they did a decent job of making you feel like we lived in a world where dark matter ruled, but the only one really worth talking about is Dawn, who I think it was cool the way there was a mystery of his identity and how he could be alive, and I'm glad it wound up being more than just he could regenerate or duplicate. And I think the Cuervo twist was interesting, but wasn't taken full advantage of. I think that could have been explored more. I was glad there was more to it than him just being, like I said, regenerating. I think that there was a really weird basic explanation of him just being the culmination of negative emotions. I don't know what else they could have done with that. He would have just been that or a generic evil. Still a better explanation than last year's villain being a bunch of amiibos. But yeah, he was just, at the end of the day, he just acted as that generic evil overlord, to be honest. I think personally it would have been a cooler arc if in the past Sergi and then later in the Change timeline the Kyurangers actually took out Dawn, and instead of him merging with Cuervo, Cuervo just straight up took his identity, because that was my theory early on, not about Cuervo, but that Dawn was killed by Sergi, but somebody took up his mantle. I think that would have been more interesting. And Cuervo, I think it was an interesting twist, and it kind of made sense motivation-wise for him to be like, okay, I suffered so much, I don't want there to be suffering, so I'm going to end suffering by making a new universe. That could have been a good motivation that was explored for why he partnered with Dawn. Like I said, I think it was a good story twist, just not fully explored. As for the other villains, honestly, I even was going through like to find pictures to use for this video, and I didn't even bother for the rest of the villains, because even though I remember the way some of them look, like the female general that popped up quite often and the male one that popped up earlier, they were honestly very forgettable. Very, very forgettable. Other than them just continuously popping up, I don't remember any of the villains having significant, like, I didn't even want to waste time getting pictures or talking about it, because I think it was a weakness that they didn't have very many memorable long-running villains other than the main villain. The only villain that was memorable other than him was Stinger's brother, who I thought was a really cool arc. I was surprised that they wound up taking him out. I honestly thought he would last longer, and I thought he would come back in some form later. But I thought that was overall a generic but solid arc, and it made him a more memorable villain by giving him a personal arc to one of the Kyurangers, a personal attachment. So I thought he was pretty cool for that, and he had a cool design. I still wish, which is something that I echoed in my earlier reviews, but I still wish that they would have gone a little bit of a different direction. I think it would have been more interesting if, instead of making him straight up evil, if he really was on their side, because he tried to manipulate him thinking, actually I'm undercover, but he really wasn't. I think it would have been more interesting if he truly was undercover and was just going to really dark places to achieve his goal, you know, really doing things that the Rangers wouldn't do, very dark and drastic decisions. I think that would have been interesting to have a character that lasted a bit longer, that was making more of the tougher choices. I think that could have been more interesting. As far as just to touch on the designs really quick, I honestly love the designs. I think the suits are fantastic. They all fit together but all stand out individually. Some of my favorites are Stinger and Commanders. I liked his pre-form. I wasn't too hot on the cape thing at first, trench coat, but it really grew on me. I love his suit. I mentioned Stinger's already. I love black suit. I really like Sergei's suit, Ho Soldiers. I think it looks really unique and cool. Like, I thought it did a really good job of like using the space theme for like the helmet, and I really like that a lot. I really do like the Q-Tamas in general. Some of the larger power-ups are a little bit cumbersome, but I loved the changers. Even though the other one, the main one's a little colorful, I did love the way it worked. I loved the voice for it. I loved Commanders being an awesome sniper, and that he self-made it again. I loved the sword-shield combo, and I really did like the mecha. Some of my favorites are Ho Soldiers. I thought that was a really cool one that almost looked retro, and I did like the designs of them. I remember a couple people saying they felt a bit lazy, but I really don't think so, because I actually really like how they used the idea that Kyuranger, even though we had a default formation, that Kyura wasn't one formation, that you could swap out the arms and the legs. And I don't know any exact statistics on how well they balanced them, but I thought they did a pretty good job of balancing them. But I overall really liked all the designs. There were some I liked less than others and some I liked more, but for the most part, I think they were really cool and unique designs. There were definitely some oddballs out there too. But overall, Kyuranger wasn't perfect. It definitely had some shaky parts, especially in the finale, but I think it was a really fun ride, and they did a really good job for their first outing, I think, of a larger cast and larger concept, and I think that they definitely could have done some things better, and I think they can perfect on some things in the future when they potentially do 9 or more Rider series, or Rider Ranger series. But I really had a lot of fun with Kyuranger. Like I said, it got me back into Sentai after sort of hating the ninja and being really blah with Zyuohger, being bland toast. This was a thoroughly enjoyable ride. It was rocky at first, but once it got started on those arcs, I honestly looked forward to watching it every week. And I got some all-time favorites out of this. Commander and Champ and Stinger and Tsurgi, some all-time favorite Sentai Rangers I'm going to have out of this. So if I had to score Kyuranger overall as a series, I probably want to objectively give it an 8, but I'm going to give it an 8.5 personally. But anyway, that's about it. Look forward to, if it hasn't already come out, because I'm not sure when this is coming out, but look forward to Pat versus Lupin soon. But that's about it for this video. I think I said that's about it 2 times. Let's say it a third. That's about it. Till next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Dawson Rider, signing out.